Season 1, Episode 4 of the Potomac RPG Podcast. You know, you likely could claim your gaming sessions as behavioral health services.
Welcome one and all to the Potomac RPG Podcast, your source for old news, tired conversation, and mediocre advice for all of your favorite tabletop role-playing games. I am your host and genuine sense of accomplishment, Adam.
I am your camaraderie-induced joy, Sara.
And I'm your feelings of acceptance and appreciation, Thom.
Well, you guys comfy? You settled in? You got your spot on the couch and you're ready to kind of dig deep into that gray matter inside your heads, because this week is going to be all about the psychological and sociological aspects of tabletop role-playing games. So we're going to get into it. This is going to be a deep episode. So I hope you guys are ready.
Yeah, I got a therapist lined up afterwards, so we'll be
That's
good.
Perfect.
I'm going to need a therapist afterwards. So yeah.
Well, the aspects that we're going to be getting into this week is not just the lead up to getting into this hobby, but also the ongoing effects from playing these games. There's a lot going on upstairs, and it isn't just remembering stat blocks and NPC names. Now, Thom, you're relatively new to tabletop RPGs and have an interesting history around this. What kept you from getting into games for such a long time?
Well, first off, I'm a bit of an introvert. I've social anxiety and jumping into a new situation where I don't know any of the people, especially in person, scary as I'll get out. So I just never really had an in. Like I was kind of, people play it. I don't know where to get a game, how to establish that. I knew nobody who actually was playing, or I didn't think to even ask anybody who played. And just getting in was I didn't know where to begin. So I kind of avoided that because there was no easy way to get in at first.
Thom, what made you decide to take a risk on this particular group in the meetup?
So, well, for starters, I was just in a really bad place. Like I was kind of didn't really have any friends. I was kind of having some issues with some people, like some of my friends I did that were close with me. So I started going into basically the anxiety of dealing with my current situation outweighed the anxiety of trying to change it. So I got on a meet. I just started looking up things, and I just happened upon a local comic book store where they were offering Sundays with dragons, and I bit the bullet and basically was like, you know what? Worst case scenario, I walk out. And
that's
I
the kind of brunch I want to go to.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I basically, it was very cliche and very kind of like, I basically walked into a dimly lit basement in a comic book store full of white, nerdy, kid guys, and they're like 30s to 40s. Like it felt very stereotyped. I about turned around and left. Yes, it did. It did have a smell. And I kind of walked in. I'm like, okay, I really don't want to be here. And one of the guys is like, hey, and the thing is, as a kind of a side tangent, I started trying to do the same thing with Magic the Gathering, and Magic the Gathering was very toxic. Like I did the same thing, and it was walked in, Caucasian, like no bad smell and everything like that, in their like 40s. And it was very much a negative response. Like I was treated like an outsider. Wow. I was snubbed because I didn't have what I needed. Like, I didn't have the right decks and everything like that. So I was expecting, and kind of coming off of that, I was expecting a very similar mindset. I walked in and I looked completely lost, and they're like, "Oh, can we help you with something?" And I said, I'm new. I don't know what I'm doing. I had 4 people pull out dice and pencils and character sheets and books, and they're like, sit down with one of us. Let us. What are you looking for? Like, start out. Like, do you play video games? What kind of characters do you like to play as? What's your interests? And like, they walked me through while the dungeon master was setting up the game and getting everything ready with the people who knew what was going on. I had two people working with me one-on-one, explain to me how it worked. And I got a Darman was his name. I got a human monk up and running in about 15 minutes. And the entire game, they were like, you sure you know what you're doing? You know, do you need help with this? And I felt immediately welcome.
That's
and
amazing.
Relief was pulled off. And I've had that, like, I've learned that that's kind of a commonplace with D&D and a lot of tabletop games where you have that mentality.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Sarah, how about you? You've been in this for a good long time. Like, did you ever experience any of this kind of social anxiety getting involved? Even, perhaps later, even though you've been playing for a long time?
I always was invited in for the most part by someone I already knew who was playing. But the one time that I ended up going to, it was I think it was Marvel's Masterminds was the campaign, or I forget I'm not saying it right, but it was just like out of the blue. I got invited because I was working at Babbage's, which was a software store.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, right. And I went, and it was really weird. There was like another girl there, which was cool, but the DM just kind of decided what my power would be, and I had like no control over like my breasts getting bigger all of a sudden and stuff like that. So I never went back.
Wow.
I don't blame you.
I don't blame you.
But all my other encounters, everyone's been super nice. Just didn't, it didn't connect except for, two really good campaigns. This is one of them. So,
yeah. Well, that's cool. Well, let's get into some questions here just to dive into this topic some more. The first question comes from Reddit user Tabuk Duo, who asks, players who don't do social interaction, how did you get past your first session? I'm not sure how long this will get, but I'll try to keep it concise. I experience pretty high levels of anxiety a lot. I, 24-year-old female, have long been diagnosed with general and social anxiety. To me, it's just a way of saying that I think too much about the wrong things at the wrong time. But I also recently learned that I am mildly on the spectrum as well, which was incredibly emotionally enlightening for me. I don't know why it matters to have a label, but something clicked, and I think it basically told me that it's okay to be confused and lost during conversations, and that my actions are not weird. That's just how I roll. Half the time I end up making things worse because I wrongly think I said or did something stupid, which I'm trying to work on. The other half of the time, I don't say or do anything at all, which is the problem here. I want to play D&D so badly. I love the making up of stories on the spot. I have a character already made for a campaign, and a friend is going to run after quarantine. Previously, I had tried to play an NPC-ish character in my boyfriend's campaign. I was super stoked about it too. Bought themed dice and a tray and everything, but when it came to my turn to introduce the character, I went mute. Honest to God, mute, which was embarrassing and super weird for me because I haven't had that happen since kindergarten or first grade. I didn't even remember that I used to do that until I looked up what the hell happened and found selective mutism. Ended up having my boyfriend play the NPC, which is what we discussed prior in case I froze up, but I was so disappointed in myself. I've gotten over so many stupid hurdles in life, and this one is one of the last. Unfortunately, I am compelled to do things really well on the first try, which is impossible standards to hold myself to. I'm much more comfortable with failure now than when I was younger, but I want to get this right so much. Has anyone had any experience getting over something like this? Any tips or tricks? So far, this is my strategy list. Write down ambiguous things to say in different situations in case I draw a blank. RP in third person. Draw the character so the table is looking mostly at that and less at me during my description of her. And maybe try the game on Discord first. Also, session 0 is going to be super fun. The DM has games and things planned, and I think a gauntlet type thing for points or feats. I'm just worried I'll screw it up for myself. I appreciate any tips I get. Thank you guys for reading. Too long didn't read. Can't talk when it's my turn, and looking for ideas to help distract my brain from itself. So, Sarah, let's turn to you first on this. What are your thoughts about Tabuk Duo's question and kind of situation that she's in?
I think that it can be very intimidating, especially if it's your first time, and also to do a voice. The one thing I just want to say to her is that the group wants you to succeed. And they also aren't going to focus on any, stumbles or stutters or, long pauses. I do it all the time here. They want your success because it is a group experience, and they aren't going to think poorly of you if the first time you try an NPC it doesn't go right. A lot of us don't even settle into our voices until we've been playing the PC or even the NPC until like the second or even sometimes the fifth meeting. So I would just say some of the steps she took are really, really smart. Discord might allow her to at least get into the character without feeling like all eyes are on her. I think that's a great way to sort of maybe get in practice with your boyfriend, and then maybe try practicing with maybe one of the other players if they're they're a good friend of you both, and go from there.
Yeah, kind of work your way into it.
Yeah.
So at least this first paragraph of like the social anxiety and not knowing what to say and everything really hits home. The actions being weird, that really hits home for me. The selective mutus, I don't have experience with that, but a lot of the points sound really good to me. Like I think again, RPing in third person. One thing that I found again, especially because when I was doing other characters, I have a habit of being quiet, not really joining in. But one thing I embraced, especially with our group, is making my first character a bard or a charismatic character, embracing the feeling of that role of, the character is something, I'm being the character, I'm being the charismatic, the extroverted character. And that kind of was a safe, like stepping point of, it's just the character. Who's that? So I can do that. I can kind of play that up as opposed to me having to be charismatic. So it's kind of that little bit of a buffer, which helped with I feel, at least for me, helped me get off the ground with the character. But in terms of like you said, Sarah, it's like they want you to succeed. Like everyone at the table wants you to succeed and wants you to just enjoy yourself.
Sure,
so
we're all there to have fun.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like it's not a you're not acting on camera. You're being who you want to be.
Well, yeah, and reading through the question, I mean, I don't want to project too much because I don't know what it's like to be going through what she's going through. So, I can't say, oh, well, this is what I did because, I can't imagine. I have no experience or no appreciation for what this feeling is like. I mean, yeah, we all get anxious, but to have it rise to that level has to be really hard to deal with. And kudos to her for trying to push through this and do something that she really wants to do. Yeah, I think I'll agree with both of you in terms of RPing in third person, I think is a big one. Just to draw from my own experience since I was fairly new, like I felt really weird about like role playing in first person in front of a group of strangers. That was a really tough thing for me to do for a long time. But it was really easy for me to say, oh, well, my character does this or does that or does it in this way, was much more comfortable for me and kind of gave me enough time until I built up that confidence and that comfort level to then start experimenting with speaking in the first person. So, I agree that what you have there sounds great. Discord, I have mixed feelings on Discord, but play by post is another option. Where okay, maybe just doing text is a good kind of entryway into that because you can get real deep into role play and kind of get that comfort level without having to, number one, speak, or number two, see anybody or have them see you. So play by post is an option as well. But regardless, we definitely feel for you. Hope that you're working through it, and best of luck to Book Duo. I can't wait to hear how your first session goes. So
yeah, you're gonna be awesome.
Yes, absolutely.
So Adam, I have some news here.
Oh well. the sound of an intelligent, highly educated Ralphie, the news goblin, can mean only one thing. I guess it's time for a Potomac RPG News Scholar Edition.
What the hell? Ralphie's been digging in your pack.
I have some informative information, Sara.
Better put that ring of intellect back.
I used to travel.
Oh, I love it.
I would definitely do
What an entrance.
And now it is time for the news.
All right. Well, thank you, Smart Ralphie. We actually have a double shot of news for you this week, which comes in the form of a couple papers released just this month that are pretty interesting. Thought they tie in pretty well with the topic this week. First up is a thesis paper by Jonathan Mendoza at Lesley University entitled Gaming Intentionally, a literature review of the viability of role-playing games as drama therapy-informed interventions. So in essence, what Mendoza is researching here are the similarities between tabletop role-playing games and psychodrama or theater, basically proposing the idea of applying drama therapy practices to tabletop role-playing and clinical game design. So it's pretty interesting stuff. Sara, I'll turn to you first. Anything in this paper reach out and grab you?
Oh, yeah. Like, I have not enjoyed reading an academic paper as much as I enjoyed this one, particularly because it breaks down some of the ways in which practitioners can use role-playing games to help with therapy. But there were a couple of sort of mishaps along, like in the history of things, where they kind of learned that you need a practitioner who is willing to look at the patient's cultural point of view, as well as like their social point of view, and also who will be a good leader within this environment, who understands the rules and make sure that anyone who helps with sort of a structure like this would also be aware of the rules. We saw some examples where in the past, like, things did not go well. For example, they were left to one practitioner introduced unsupervised D&D play as an activity for a ward under his direction, and they came together in sort of a resistance to therapy and use that as an avenue of escape, where the dungeon was the ward and the escape was the clear and obvious goal.
That was the Osherman study, right?
Yes, and the structure of the game and the supervision and education of the staff wasn't where it needed to be to kind of have some sort of benefits of it, but they learned from that there was perhaps a way to do some more. So.
Sure. And I really like this idea of using, tabletop role playing as some kind of therapeutic modality, whether that's through drama therapy or whatever. I mean, we see indications of that throughout. For example, cognitive behavioral therapy has the use of role play, and this isn't too far away from that in terms of how having a PC within a role-playing setting can help engage in some of the issues that a client might be facing. But I agree wholeheartedly. Like, it seemed to really dig in on the fact that this has to be directed with intention, that the staff have to be familiar with what's going on, and kind of a controlled, directed practice of a session. Thom, anything kind of leap out to you within this study?
And again, I think it's I remember seeing the part about how they, like Sara, you mentioned with them having issues with unsupervised and how they came up with their own ideas which were negative. For me, it's there's a lot of potential, but again, that's why I guess that to be a bit meta is this study itself explains more why we need more studies into this, is to understanding the pitfalls and the benefits. I can understand like the aspects of in role play and a safe environment, and being able to parse out these emotions and understanding of yourself as well as the world around you. But it does have a huge gate limit of again understanding the rules, understanding what the potential is, and being able to keep it in that defined limit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Sarah, I know that you keyed in on this aspect of bleed that was mentioned within the paper. Yeah, can you kind of explain what bleed is and how that's seen within an RPG?
Yeah, so bleed, and I'm taking this straight from the paper, is the mixing of emotional response and motivation between the player and the character, or the internalized emotion and external presences. It's basically the process by which clients project aspects of themselves on their experiences into theatrical or dramatic materials into enactment. They're externalizing their internal conflicts, basically. And I thought that was really, really interesting. Because the reason, so this is kind of a fairly new sort of approach. And by new, I mean like 90s, 2000s. And part of that reason, especially with D&D, is because they had to overcome the satanic panic, and all the negativity around that. There were practitioners who didn't understand it, who there were some who even marked it as a psychopathology if you played. Because and then as they became more and more familiar with the game, that number tends to diminish the number of people who would think that. And then they started having success, and it's because of this bleed that they're able to do that. So, so basically, what's happening is the character's experiencing something, and you, as the player, are also experiencing a bit of it, but it's at a distance. But the player is sort of letting some of their inner conflicts kind of manifest inside the game, and the game and its structure isn't limiting. It's supposed to provide safety and remove confusion, because you already understand the mechanics for how things are supposed to work. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of success stories that they did find through RPG play when it is done under like supervision and with therapy in mind. They found an increase in self-efficacy and communication, and the ability to come to a consensus, not through majority vote, but through like discussion in children with special needs. There was a 19-year-old who was presenting with obsessional schizoid personality. He told his therapist, Blackman, who's probably the lead, I would say, just based on some papers that we've read, the leading psychiatrist behind this, about the time that this 19-year-old spent playing D&D. And Blackman at first didn't want him to bring in these stories because he felt like he was kind of dodging, the therapy itself was kind of like insulating himself. Yeah. But then he decided to let those stories in. And Blackman came to notice that the use of D&D was kind of its own self-therapy. Because the 19-year-old played a character that enabled them to have an outlet for working through emotions in a safe, displaced way. And I think that's very key, because I've known a few people who maybe aren't as expressive in life, or maybe there's just things that they don't want to be vulnerable because that's weakness, or they just all these things, right? But in the game, you can let a little bit more emotion show. How do you guys feel about that? Like, have you seen that?
Well, go ahead, Thom. You jump in on this.
So, yeah, I think that having played D&D, clearly, the aspect of bleed I feel is interesting, because I do understand that. I can relate to that of having the you can also, I feel like it again kind of goes to the acting and the psychology of it, is you can kind of be over the top. You can push emotions and response to things a bit more. They're more exaggerated than the average person would be. So I feel like you can kind of push and pull and kind of, I'm trying to think the level of it. I guess you can extend it beyond what you normally could. And I feel like it does play a huge role in again, therapy and understanding what it is, that emotional intelligence. And I think that's an excellent example in this of how it can be applied.
Sure. And I think, again, it kind of comes back to that directed practice on this, because that bleed that we kind of see, like I remember Sara, you and Ben, when we were talking character creation, and we just made a joke that, all of Ben's characters were Ben, like that but that's really what we see in all of our characters. There are pieces of us, and being able to kind of explore that is great. But when it comes to mental health, and it's one thing if we kind of experience that just kind of on our own playing the game, but in terms of a treatment modality, something used therapeutically, if it's not directed, that bleed can be dangerous as well. So it's something to kind of keep in mind, that, your D&D group is not your therapy session unless your therapy session is D&D. There's a real fine line to walk there, and we'll get more into that later. But I'd like to jump into a couple other areas within this article or paper. One was this study, which I loved. It was Roslet and Stauffer from 2013, and it talked about using weekend RPG camps, which blew my mind. I didn't know there were weekend RPG camps. Did you guys?
I did not. I would have signed up right away.
Oh my God. Like, where was this when I was growing up? I would have loved to go to a weekend RPG camp. But they set it up to create basically a sandbox of experimentation for social behaviors, which I thought, hey, that's pretty freaking cool. Like, that's something that I'd love to be a fly on the wall and watch that kind of stuff. But, to kind of get into how this works as that therapeutic approach, it starts getting into something called scaffolding. And basically the reason why tabletop role-playing can work with whether it's drama therapy or whatever, is this use of scaffolding. That's the rules of the game that allows for a foundation in order to explore those aspects. So it gives everybody kind of a base to work off of. And I think that's really important. And I'd like to step out for a moment here, take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to dive more into this scaffolding issue. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Let me tell you a little bit about Found Familiar. They have some of the absolute best coffee around, and it caters to people just like us, people who love D&D. So try some today. You won't be disappointed. If you're looking for a recommendation, try their regular Knoll Modern Espresso. No trouble perking up at the table after drinking this stuff. Enter the coupon code Potomac RPG, all one word, at checkout and get yourself a 10% discount as well. That's foundfamiliar.com. And with that, let's get back to the show. Welcome back. All right, we are in the midst of a scholarly discussion on using role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games, for therapy of some kind. So we've been talking a bit about this first paper from Mendoza. Out of Lesley University, and we started getting into this idea of scaffolding, which is the rule set around a tabletop role playing game that gives a foundation for people to work off of. And because of these rules, it gives them a chance to explore aspects of not only their character but other characters with something to kind of set on, if that makes sense. So for example, it mentions in the paper that the use of NPCs, where a client can interact with an NPC who might be struggling with problems similar to their own, really struck me as wow, isn't that a perfect way to be able to start to address some of the issues that you might have by experiencing forms of those issues within NPCs in the game. And that really struck me. And Thom, I'm kind of curious what your thoughts of that are in terms of encountering an NPC. Let's go with the social anxiety side of things, or and how you might react to an NPC who's exhibiting some issues that you may have felt.
May I just jump in here and mention that Thom's first character that you played that I know of in our group was a bard. So for social anxiety, you really chose the most social.
Yeah, and that a couple points to unpack with that. One, like to answer your question real quick, Sarah, is that the bard is, I came in with I'm going to do a bard, and I told the DM, I was like, hey, I like to do a bard, but I'm not going to be singing. I'm not going to be talking much. I'm very introverted. Can I still do a bard? Because I think it's something cool. Like, yeah, sure, do that. And not really thinking about it, I sort of embodied the role of the character, and kind of being like, I'm just doing the character. I'm able to play with it in that safe, kind of microcosm. And if it comes out, weird or awkward or doesn't sound right, it's just the character. It's not specifically me, but I'm able to, play those roles and kind of, suss out that identity, and then use those traits later on with, in my real life. So I was able to kind of experiment with that. But like what you said with the scaffolding, Adam, is it working with an NPC is you're able to not only relate to that character in a way like, oh, there's another person who has, I understand where they're coming from, and how would I treat myself if I was doing that without it actually being yourself? It's like, how would I treat someone like me?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what you think about that, Sarah, in terms of, being able to see yourself in NPCs and things that they might be exhibiting that you yourself exhibit in real life.
Oh, wow, that's a loaded question. I don't even know how to approach that, because I think I like to. Why do I play? There's
I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, there's so many things going on in my head right now. Okay, so yeah, when I see an NPC that we're having to like a problem with, or to get a way around, or I believe it promotes empathy. Not that I have a problem necessarily with empathy, but you can really that man had a family, or something like that. I think it helps sort of put into focus the consequences of our actions. So I can't be a hobo murderer. I don't really have that instinct though. But I guess I have a very strong instinct to evangelize, and we can unpack maybe why that is. So I, with Mina, I really wanted to convert everyone to my way of thinking.
Yes, you did.
Everyone. And I actually really enjoyed that, because I like challenging people's points of view and points of reference and philosophies. I think that's the space where you can learn even more about them, because their political stance and I mean, it's like their blueprint, right, for living. If you can find out what their faith or philosophy is and sort of ask them about that. So I think that's probably why that comes out. And yeah, so that's why you guys always have to talk me off the ledge from playing a cleric. I guess I need, or a paladin or something faith-based. Yeah. But I'm kind of lost when I'm not. So I don't know. I just like exploring those aspects of characters. So.
And to kind of piggyback off of what you were saying, Sarah, with playing a cleric and finding those roles and kind of what you're finding a bit of yourself in that. I've learned a lot with my characters as well. Like the answer of the bard, Brooke was, very outgoing and had that role. But I've learned that I inherently you like to evangelize and, learn about people. And then with mine is I tend to make always the good characters. I tried making Green the rough and tumble, edgy assassin, and he turned out to be a big teddy bear in the end, because that's the role I kind of shifted towards. As my personality kind of came through.
I love green.
But like he just went from like cold-blooded assassin to, oh, let me be your friend, and granted, a lot of RP did that, but like it was interesting seeing that growth and trying to hold to a line of a different character archetype.
Sure.
That's awesome.
And I agree, and I know we're kind of diving into kind of our personal experiences, but these papers kind of evoke that, because I read through the different papers, and I was thinking to myself, okay, in terms of bleed, we talked about bleed. How have I might have noticed that in my characters, and I think back to my first character, Finbin, the halfling barbarian, who was orphaned and couldn't speak very well and all that, and I'm like, okay, so what was kind of driving that? Why was I wanting to play that? And just the idea of experiencing loneliness, I guess, was a big aspect of his character. I don't want to get too far off on a tangent, so I do want to bring it back to this paper. The last kind of section of it starts talking about, tabletop role-playing game structure and the different games that are available. And I thought this was interesting because it does cite D&D as having a good structure, but doesn't inherently encourage role-play. And I mean, you can look at kind of the OSR, the old school Renaissance, that type of play definitely was geared more towards, tactical, wargamey, not so much role play. Even in 5th edition, there is no requirement for role play. So there's not a whole lot there to really encourage it. However, there are games, specifically mentioned are PBTA games that do really well with this. Games like Masks, Monster Hearts, City of Mist, where they use archetypes of characters coping with balancing things like, being a civilian who also has superpowers, and how they kind of struggle with that or manage that within their lives. And I thought the biggest point about PBTA games in terms of using it under a therapeutic model is that you gain experience by failing. It's not by succeeding that you progress your character, but by failing. And I thought that was a really interesting aspect to be used within a therapeutic environment. And Sarah, what do you think about that? How PBTA games approach that in terms of character development?
I think first of all, I think it's awesome to emphasize that you can get EXP from failing. Can I just say that as someone who is very afraid of success and failure? I'm great at turning, but I feared failure because it meant I was bad, or something. It hit me psychologically, right? As it just why do I even bother? Even when I was a kid, right? I was very black and white about it. And I feel like that is a really cool thing to emphasize. And I was also really intrigued by Monster Hearts because it allows you to explore identity and queerness as a teenager. And I think Masks as well was also focused on teenage sort of development. And I think those are very key points. I mean, those are our formative years, right? That's when I learned to be afraid of success and failure, or, whatever. But also where we learn so much about the world, and it kicks us back. And it's a huge crapshoot as to whether or not you're in an accepting environment or you're in a hostile environment. And all that is going to play out for the rest of your adult life, even in small ways. So to be able to explore that in a safe space, to be able to articulate what you're feeling, what you're drawn to, what your identity might truly be in a safe space, I think is brilliant. Yeah. And then they also focused on the Revived, which was a support group for the partially deceased, which is literally therapy.
Wow. That is something.
Yeah. And he said when he ran it, Mendoza, he just ran like a part of it, and he had the players talk to an empty chair. And then afterward, a player came up to him and asked if that was a real therapeutic technique. And he said, yeah, why are you asking? And the player said they'd never thought talking to an empty chair could feel so fulfilling, and wanted to see about using it in their own therapy. So that's yet another example of how creating that safe space and that distance can help people in so many ways. And I
Sure.
I don't know, found this so fascinating.
Yeah, well, and I highly recommend anyone listening to read through this paper. It's a really good one. That's Jonathan Mendoza at Lesley University, and the name of the paper is "Gaming Intentionally: A Literature Review of the Viability of Role-Playing Games as Drama Therapy Informed Interventions." Now, I want to get to the second paper that we were looking at before too long here, and this is a little bit different. Basically, it's titled "An Examination of Gaming Environments in Dungeons and Dragons Groups." And this is a paper from Joe Lasley from the University of San Diego. And it's basically a qualitative study where a group of people were solicited to play, D&D fifth edition. And then through group observation and semi-structured interviews, they found that the game environment in D&D was this psychologically multi-layered container with all sorts of stuff going on during gameplay. And what Lasley was getting at with this research was to try to look into the possibility of introducing tabletop role-playing game aspects into non-gaming activities, such as, leadership development. Now, Thom, I'm going to go to you first on this one. You think there's a value in porting tabletop role-playing game methods and environments into the non-gaming world?
I definitely do. A few interesting things with this, and this paper kind of pointed out to that. It, leadership roles. I really enjoyed the aspect and the perspective of how they discussed how a leadership learning to be a leader is not very accessible. If you think about it, like if people need to be a leader for their job or their career, or they have to go to some sort of training for leadership, which means that it's a conference or it's a thing. And one of the key components that they mentioned is when you're going to something like that, you're being trained to be a single leader. You are the leader of this group. You are the leader of this corporation or this team. And that's only one perspective, and it's very one note. Like it can lead to some difficulties in terms of teamwork because you're supposed to be in charge. And the thing that a lot of role-playing games that they're noticing is that they're collaborative leadership. And it's more accessible because it's a game. It's a tool that a lot of people can access where each person is leading their own role as part of the team, and you're not looking towards a single leader to work with. That was one aspect of the paper that I thought was really interesting, where they talked about, again, the leadership training. But if it in terms of role-playing games and other aspects, there actually already is a initiative going on. It's called Reacting to the Past for Barnard College. They're actually doing role-playing games as a term of engaged learning. And it's funny because, again, this paper, one thing that was really interesting, it's a long paper. It was 174 words, but like the first 60 pages,
not words.
Yeah, misspoke. A lot more words than that. I can count. But the first 50 so pages was just describing kind of in a layman's term of what D&D is, what role-playing games are. And it was a very interesting because not only was I able to explain to my mother, who is an educator, but also my roommate's girlfriend, who's an educator. And a way using this paper, I explained to them what D&D was or what a tabletop game was from this perspective, and they understood it. I've tried explaining D&D and they kind of glaze over. It's oh, it's a game. But explaining it in terms of how this paper explained it from that kind of outside looking in perspective, they're immediately oh yeah, that's a technique, and there's a technique. And then my mother actually, because she was actually at a conference where they talked about Reacting to the Past, and she referenced it to me and talking about it. And she mentioned, they would actually, it wasn't like you're adventuring and doing D&D game, like a D&D game, but they had dice, they had traits, and they actually played out characters from history. And they did that role, and they played out sequences from history, which some of them were, this is what actually happened for the Great Depression or from a specific war. But you might be playing an ambassador, a real person, but you play that role and you have the information that they had, and you make decisions. And then just like a D&D game, you roll dice to see how those decisions play out. And it might actually follow history, what actually happened in history, or it might go something completely different based off of what your decisions.
That's interesting. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, and it's a very, very, very cool and a lot of a lesser known thing. And it's coming out. but they're doing initiatives, and all the resources are free. So you could actually apply that to what you're doing as well. Like if you're a teacher or an educator.
That's great.
Well, I actually I wonder too, and maybe this is mentioned in the paper, but I just don't recall it. When you play a historical figure or any sort of figure, because of that bleed, there's going to be maybe an emotional imprint, right? Mm-hmm. I wonder if that helps you remember the details, because we tend to remember things based on how they made us feel at a time, rather than what was said.
That's definitely a interesting concept. I hadn't thought about that.
That's really cool.
Yeah. Well, Sarah, with this paper, like, and Thom was right. It dives into a lot of explanation of terminology and background and stuff like that. Was there anything that kind of stood out to you in this paper specifically? It does get into the leader-member exchange and kind of building those the skills within a group setting. Anything jump out at you?
Yeah, actually, in the theory framework, they talked about the psychological theories that were guiding this particular work, and it kind of resonated with the previous paper, and it actually leads to a question that I want to ask both of you. So we've discussed how role-playing is a safe displacement of emotions, that we create this space together. One of the things they also said is that the players can feel the effects, this is part of bleed, both positive and negative, of behavior affecting emotions released during gameplay, even after the play is concluded. Mm-hmm. That we appreciate intense emotional experiences involving tragedy or horror, or whatever, when self-selected for this experience. So my question for you is, after I give you this quote, the game served as waking fantasy that gave form to a person's internal fantasies and their life. So we touched on a little bit about the benefits of it when it comes to like talking to an NPC, and how we sort of engaged with our characters. But I want to ask you, is there an internal fantasy that you're pursuing when you sort of show up and play?
Oh, I am going to pull rank and shove this right over to Thom, because that's blowing my mind there. Okay, so all right, I'll be nice here. So that gave form to a person's internal fantasies.
Yes.
I mean, I could answer this if you want it. If you want to throw it to me,
please do, because I'm thinking right now. Go ahead, Thom.
Just like my intro, it being accepted and being appreciated, that's a big aspect of my personality. It's not feeling like an outsider, and that's a fantasy that I've always, and I think that's probably why a lot of my characters become goody two shoes and avoid conflict type B personalities, because I want to be part of the team. I want to be included. I want to do well, and I want everyone to accept me, for better or for worse. And that's something that I know I play out a lot in my characters. And I do that seems to happen. That does happen a lot with my characters. So.
Well, and I'll jump in here. Like I would say, out of the characters that you guys are aware of, I would say Milo, who is a rogue artificer mix, is probably the closest thing to giving rise to an internal fantasy, and the reason being is she's extremely charismatic, very kind of witty, very sharp tongued, and that is something that I just am not. When it comes to taking like a wisecrack or just being kind of quick on the uptake, that is not me. So being able to play this character who, by the rules, she's very, very good at persuasion, very good at deception, and that kind of silver-tongued character really kind of is a fantasy of mine, in terms of being that kind of person, like that the people who just exude so much confidence that no matter what the situation is, they're going to be able to talk their way out of it one way or another. That is just really amazing to me. And I would say that's the closest character that's kind of come close to awakening that internal fantasy in the games that we've played.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing.
I'm going to shove it right back to you as well there, Sarah. But how about you? What was your personal internal fantasies?
So for context, as an adolescent, I really, really loved the Phantom of the Opera, Silence of the Lambs, Dangerous Liaisons. And the one thing that these all had in common was they had a mentor character who was dangerous to the protagonist. And for some reason, I love to this day that intellectual dueling, where you can learn something, but also this person just might end your career or your life, depending on the context. And so I'm always seeking ways to creatively duel, and I don't find any satisfaction in the like sword fight or anything like that, because there's mechanics, it's a role, there's not really a lot of room for creativity. There is, but it's just not the same. And I think that's probably why I gravitate towards characters who have like a faith agenda or something, or like if they were working for Crown or something and their mission was to seduce an entire party, I would love the stuffing out of that, because I would work each one in slow-mo and try not to let on what I was doing. And I would just love every single moment of that. So I don't know why, I just do. And it shows up in my writing and still to this day in the kinds of stories that I love to watch or read. So.
Well, that's awesome. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. No, that's a heck of a good question. I appreciate it. Yeah, let's jump into our last question of the week. I know we're running a bit long, but it's a good question to kind of end the show on. So this is a post from Reddit user Sam the Banana Girl, who asks, players rely on D&D. Exactly as the title says. I wanted to see if I couldn't find other DMs or players that have experienced this. The too long didn't read is that every once in a while, real life comes up, and for whatever reason, I can't DM a session. This doesn't occur frequently, which is impressive considering my players are playing every 3 days. Why aren't we playing every 3 days? That would be amazing. We are all students. Oh, that's why. Okay. But it's hell and they are burning me out. The issue arises that for whatever reason, I need to cancel the session, usually well ahead of time, but it has occurred where I need to cancel basically last minute if a family issue arises. My players may send me a story about how they need to play D&D tonight because this week has just been so rough to them, which is valid. However, I don't want D&D to turn into therapy for my players or for them to rely on it. Yes, I love D&D and I'm passionate about creative writing, but I can't endorse my game turning into therapy for them. I'm not their therapist. So, this person says, so Reddit, how should I handle this? And I'm going to say, so Thom and Sarah, how should she handle this?
Oh. Well, so it sounds to me like she's getting burnt out. I mean, every 3 days requires a lot of preparation on the DM's part. Yeah. But this is obviously something that people are looking forward to. It's their escape. It's their chance to bond with others, be creative, and all the things we discussed today. So my advice to her would be to maybe not have it every 3 days, or see if someone else wants to DM so that she can get a break. Because she going at this pace, it's going to, I think, lead to resentment because, sure. And everyone really wants, a heads up if you're going to delay it, but you're not going to be able to control that kind of disappointment. It's going to happen whether you tell them 3 days ahead of time or 3 minutes ahead of time. Probably just a little bit more anger 3 minutes ahead of time. What do you think, Thom?
Well, so I agree with you wholeheartedly. Like 3 times a week is a lot. And I feel like because one aspect that's mentioned through a lot of these papers and everything is that, D&D or tabletop games and a lot of the premise of this is, the safe space and everything. It's escapism. It's a way to, postpone reality and do things, react and live and establish relationships in a microcosm that you can control more, it feels like. So I feel like having it this much, they've basically, and if they're having difficulties in their own life, they're basically latching on to D&D as a escapism. To reference the movie Inception, where people would basically, they would put themselves in the dream world because they could control it, and they were avoiding reality as much as possible. I feel like that's a kind of a slippery slope when you're doing it this much. And to point out that, which you said, like, having different DMs, I feel like it would be very helpful to have multiple DMs with multiple games where they're playing different roles, different characters. So they're not latching on so much to one identity and one escapism. They could have, multiple escapes, and that you have that jumping back and forth. It prevents too much of the sameness, I should say, where they can get comfortable in that sense too much. Granted, that's just my opinion. I don't know how well that'll help, but yeah, I feel like it's too much.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned escapism, and that's kind of like, I have a problem with that word sometimes, because that has been a long criticism of D&D, that it was an unhealthy form of escapism, and escapism in its actual definition, yes, that's absolutely unhealthy. But oftentimes I describe our D&D sessions as, it's an escape. It's a chance to press pause on dealing with the real world for an hour or for 3 to 4 hours before you hop back into it. And I think that's the key. Like, are they using it to avoid dealing with real life? Or are they using it as just a brief respite from life? And I think that's kind of an important marker there is, okay, are you using this to avoid something that you should not be avoiding?
Well, I feel like you could say that with anything, though. Anything that
Sure.
you could escape with, reading a book, video games,
yeah.
running. I know of people who would run to escape the problems in their life, to the point where it actually became a detriment. They started getting repetitive injuries because they would run for hours every day. Like something as simple as
Sure.
that, as exercise. It's escapism. So I feel like you could to clarify. I agree with you, Adam. And you could say that for most anything. Everything in moderation. You could, and depends on how you're using it.
I agree. And now in terms of answering Sam's question here, I think you guys are right on the money. Having other people DM, it shouldn't be reliant just on you to DM 3 days a week. I mean, heck, that's more than a full-time job. But if you're doing all the prep and everything like that. And in addition, if you're noticing that they are using this as almost a form of therapy, and I thought this was an appropriate question given our topic. The whole thing about the therapeutic method used was that it was directed. There was purpose behind it in a therapy kind of environment. D&D on its own is not a therapeutic environment unless it's directed as such. So if you're noticing that should set off some alarm bells for you that hey, if they're too dependent on this, and like you said, Thom, if it's just one campaign and they're just so into this one character, this is breaching a boundary in my mind. And I think by switching up the DMs, you can break some of that cycle. So I think you guys are right on the money in terms of best way to handle that. Or sometimes just, hey, take a break, literally take a break for a while and reset so that dependency doesn't remain in place.
Yeah, it's no fun when the DM isn't having any fun. I mean, everyone should be having fun.
Absolutely. Well, hey guys, we've had a lot of fun here today.
Yeah.
we've my head hurts a little bit.
Me too.
I think it was a great conversation. I really appreciate your insight on this stuff. But I think that is going to do it for us this week. Remember, if you want to send in your questions or anything you find on the internet, you can send them to questions@potomacripg.com. And if you'd like to support the Potomac RPG podcast, you can visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/Potomac RPG. Lastly, you can follow us at Potomac_RPG on Twitter and at Potomac RPG, all one word, on Instagram and YouTube. Big thank you to Sara and Thom for being on the show and joining in the fun today. Thank you to the rest of the Potomac RPG crew, and of course, all of our wonderful listeners out there. So for the Potomac RPG podcast, I'm Adam.
I'm Sara.
And I'm Thom.
till next time, keep those dice rolling, keep those stories coming, and
Never
stop
playing.
Jeez.
I think we were good, Adam. You and I were pretty on point.
Oh, sure. Blame me.
let's start that one over again.
It's okay. Failure is acceptable.
I just leveled up.
You get XP for that.
Yeah.